The snow had been falling since before dawn. By the time Ethan Cole stepped onto the front porch of the Hale estate on Ridgeline Drive, Aspen had buried itself under 8 inches of fresh powder, and the sky was still working on more. It was the kind of morning that made the town look like something inside a glass globe, beautiful and sealed off from everything real. He held a mug of black coffee in both hands. He wasn't wearing a coat. He never wore a coat in the mornings anymore, not since Noah had started stealing his jackets to build forts in the hallway. He stood there in a gray thermal shirt and jeans, watching the snow come down through the pines, and he thought about Daniel. He thought about Daniel almost every morning. Behind him, through the floor-to-ceiling windows of a house that had never really felt like his, he could hear the faint sound of the television some nature program Noah always put on before breakfast, the low murmur of a narrator's voice explaining the migration patterns of Arctic birds. He could also hear, from somewhere deeper in the house, the careful silence that Victoria Hale moved through when she didn't want to be heard. She appeared in the doorway at 7:14. She was already dressed. She was always already dressed, charcoal blazer, dark trousers, her dark hair pulled back in a way that said the day had been organized before the sun came up. She held a manila envelope in one hand. She set it on the porch railing beside his coffee mug without ceremony, without preamble, as if she were leaving a report on a desk. "It's all there," she said. "$2 million, as we discussed." Ethan looked at the envelope. He didn't pick it up. "The terms of the arrangement," she continued, "are fulfilled. Lily's custody case closed in our favor last week. There's no legal reason for this to continue. The check is yours. You've more than earned it." She said it the way she said most things, clearly, without inflection, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Victoria Hale was many things, but she was never unclear. Ethan took a sip of his coffee. "I'm not taking it," he said. A pause. The snow fell. "Ethan." She studied him the way she studied quarterly projections, looking for the variable she hadn't accounted for. $2 million, she said. "For 7 months of your time. That's not an insult. That's more than generous." "I know it is." "Then why?" "Because I didn't do it for the money." He finally looked at her. "I did it because I told Daniel I would." Victoria's expression didn't change. It never changed, or almost never, he had learned, in 7 months of living under the same roof, to read the things that happened in the margins of her face, the slight stillness around her eyes, the way her jaw set a fraction tighter. "Daniel has been gone for 14 months, she said. "I know how long he's been gone." She picked the envelope back up, held it out to him. "Take it, Ethan, please. It's the clean way to end this." He looked at the envelope in her hand and thought about clean endings, about what it would mean to take that check and drive his truck back to the garage on Galena Street and go back to being a man who fixed engines for a living. He thought about Noah eating cereal at the kitchen island in there, probably still in pajamas. He thought about Lily, who slept with a nightlight shaped like a crescent moon that Ethan had found at the hardware store 3 months ago, after she'd woken up screaming 4 nights in a row. He thought about Daniel's voice on that last night, ragged and thin, saying, "Promise me, Ethan. Not just the girl. Her too." "I'll be late for the garage," he said, and went back inside. Victoria stood on the porch alone. The snow kept falling. The envelope stayed in her hand. From the hardware store 2 blocks down on Main Street, from the diner where half the town ate breakfast, from the ski lodge where the seasonal staff was setting up for another day, the rumors had already been circulating for months. "Did you hear? Ethan Cole, the mechanic, he married Victoria Hale, the millionaire. Can you believe it?" Nobody could believe it. Nobody understood it. And so they invented reasons, the way small towns do money, manipulation, a scam of some kind. No one guessed the truth. The truth was too quiet for gossip. 14 months earlier, the storm had been biblical. Ethan had been at his garage when the call came Daniel's number on his phone, which was strange because Daniel never called during work hours. He always texted. They'd been that way since college. two men who communicated in fragments. Friday? Yeah. Same place? Obviously. A phone call meant something was wrong. It was wrong. Daniel Hale, 41 years old, founder of Hale Logistics, husband and father, Ethan's closest friend since the age of 7, had been sitting in his car outside the hospital for 40 minutes because he couldn't make himself go back inside. His voice on the phone was the voice of a man who had used up all his steadiness and was now running on something thinner. They're saying 6 to 8 weeks, Daniel said. Maybe less. Ethan sat down on the concrete floor of his garage, right there among the oil stains and the tire irons, and he let Daniel talk. That was always his part, listening, holding the shape of the conversation so the other person didn't have to carry it alone. Daniel talked about the diagnosis, about the speed of it, about the way Victoria had gone very still when the doctor finished speaking, and how that stillness frightened him more than anything the doctor had said. She's going to try to handle it alone, Daniel said. That's what she does. She'll manage it like a problem to be solved, and she'll push people away, and she'll convince herself that's strength. She's strong, Ethan said carefully. She's terrified. Daniel's voice dropped. She doesn't let people in, Heath. Not even me, sometimes. Not all the way. And Lily, he stopped. Ethan could hear the catch of breath. Lily's going to need someone who knows how to wait. You know what I mean? Not fix it. Just wait. The blizzard had turned serious by the time Ethan left the garage that evening. He drove to the hospital through roads that were already closing, and he sat in the parking lot until Daniel came out, and they sat together in Ethan's truck for an hour while the world went white around them. Daniel talked. At the end, Daniel turned to him and asked the thing he'd been building toward all night. If something happens to me, and it's going to, we both know that now I need you to look after them. Not financially. Victoria has more money than God. I mean actually look after them. Be there. Be present. Of course, Ethan said. It wasn't even a decision. It was just the truth. I mean it as a promise, Daniel said. Not as a gesture. I know the difference. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Outside, the snow made the world look like it had no edges. She won't make it easy for you, he said. I'm not afraid of difficult. Daniel almost smiled at that. No, he said. You never were. He died 6 weeks later, in January, on a Tuesday morning, with Victoria sitting on one side of the bed and Lily on the other. Lily, who was 7 years old and had not yet understood that some things go away and don't come back. Ethan stood in the doorway of that hospital room for a long moment before the nurse gently redirected him to the waiting area. He didn't see Daniel's face at the end, but he heard Lily's voice afterward, small and absolutely certain, saying, "Daddy, Daddy." Wake up, and he knew then, with the weight of something permanent, that the promise was no longer abstract. He attended the funeral. He stood at the back. He watched Victoria hold Lily's hand through the entire service without ever sitting down, as if sitting down would mean admitting something she wasn't ready to admit. Her face was composed. Her back was straight. The snow outside the church windows was the same color as her skin. He watched Lily stare at the floor. He didn't introduce himself. He went home and made dinner and helped Noah with homework and lay in the dark for a long time, thinking about the shape a promise takes when the person you made it to is no longer there to hold it. The call from Victoria came 4 months later, in spring, when the snow had finally retreated and Aspen was tentatively green again. Her voice on the phone was professional, careful, the voice she used in business meetings. "I need a favor," she said, as if they were acquaintances who traded favors. As if he hadn't sat with her husband in a blizzard while Daniel said his goodbyes. The situation, she explained, was this. Daniel's brother, Marcus Hale, had filed for partial custody of Lily. His argument, supported by a lawyer and 2 affidavits, was that Victoria, a woman running a logistics company, frequently traveling, widowed and, in the court's language, without a stable domestic partner or co-parenting support structure, was not providing an optimal environment for a grieving child. Lily had stopped talking at school. She'd been sent home twice for panic episodes. Her therapist was seeing her 3 times a week. Marcus Hale was not a monster. He genuinely believed he was helping. He was also, in Ethan's experience, a man who liked winning more than he liked most other things. And he had a good lawyer. Victoria needed a husband. Quickly, legally, and without complication. "I know this is an extraordinary thing to ask," she said. "Yes," Ethan said. "I'll compensate you fairly. Whatever you think is $2 million, he said. Not because he wanted it, because he needed the number to exist so they could both understand the transaction they were pretending this was. She agreed immediately, which told him she would have paid 4. They were married in the Pitkin County Courthouse on a Wednesday, with a judge and 2 clerks as witnesses, Noah in the only collared shirt he owned, and Lily standing beside her mother in a blue dress, staring at the middle distance with the careful blankness of a child who has learned that the world will rearrange itself without her permission. The judge said the words. Victoria signed first, neat and precise. Ethan signed second, and his hand was steady, and he didn't look at the amount on the check she'd had prepared, because it didn't matter. They moved into the Ridgeline Drive house that weekend. Ethan brought his tools, his books, Noah's collection of hand-carved wooden animals, and one photograph, Daniel and Ethan at 22, standing outside a truck they'd spent the whole summer restoring, grinning like idiots. He hung it in his bedroom. Victoria saw it once when she passed in the hallway and said nothing. The arrangement was simple. They shared a house, shared meals when necessary, maintained the appearance of a functioning family for the court and for the custody evaluator who would visit twice. Separate rooms, separate lives, where possible. Polite coexistence. Victoria referred to it, without irony, as the arrangement. Ethan referred to it, in conversations with himself, as Tuesday. Lily did not speak to Ethan for the first 3 weeks. She was not hostile. She was not afraid of him, exactly. She was somewhere more remote than that in a country with no roads in, where even grief couldn't reach her efficiently. She ate at the table, went to school, came home, went to her room. Sometimes she sat on the back porch and watched the mountain. She did not play, she did not laugh. She occasionally stood in doorways for long moments before entering or leaving rooms, as though calculating something. Her therapist, a woman named Dr. Pratt, had told Victoria that Lily's processing of Daniel's death was complicated by the speed of it the way it came and then simply ended. Too fast for a child's understanding to catch up. The silence was protective, not punitive. "Give her space," Dr. Pratt had said. "Don't push. Don't perform happiness at her. Just be present." Victoria found this advice difficult. She was not built for passivity. She wanted to fix things, solve things, move toward resolution. Watching her daughter be unreachable was the closest thing to helplessness she had ever felt, and helplessness was, for Victoria Hale, the most intolerable of sensations. Ethan, by contrast, found it natural. He had grown up with a father who didn't talk much, who communicated in proximity rather than words, who showed up, who stayed, who fixed things without being asked and was present without being loud about it. Ethan had inherited this quality without fully understanding it as a quality. It just seemed like the obvious way to be. He started leaving things. Not gifts, exactly. More like evidence. A glass of apple juice on the porch railing when she was sitting outside. A blanket over the arm of her chair before she came downstairs in the morning. Once, a small smooth river stone on the window ledge of her room. He'd found it by the creek at the edge of the property, and thought she might like the weight of it in her hand. He never mentioned these things. He just put them there. The night of the first bad storm in October was when something shifted. It came in fast, the kind of mountain storm that announces itself with a sudden pressure drop and then arrives fully formed, wind and lightning and snow all at once. The power flickered at 9:15 and went out completely at 9:20. Lily had been asleep or nearly asleep, and the darkness woke her the way darkness sometimes does when a child's nervous system is already running too close to the surface. Ethan heard her before Victoria did. He was in the hallway getting a flashlight from the closet when the sound came, not screaming. Exactly, but a high, airless sound. The sound of someone whose breathing has gotten away from them. He knocked twice on her door, said, "It's Ethan," and went in. She was sitting up in bed with her knees pulled to her chest, both hands fisted in the sheets. The room was very dark. The wind was loud. He didn't turn on the flashlight. He crossed the room and sat down on the floor, not on the bed, not beside her, just on the floor at the foot of it, back against the wall. He said nothing. He just sat there. After a moment, he started talking. Not to her, specifically, just into the room. He told her about the time he and Daniel were 12, and they'd gotten caught in a storm out near the reservoir, and they'd found an old irrigation shed and waited it out, and Daniel had been so scared of the lightning that he'd tried to hide under a tarp that smelled like motor oil, and how they'd laughed about that for years afterward. He talked slowly, without urgency. He didn't require her to respond. 20 minutes later, her breathing had slowed. 30 minutes later, she had lain back down, not asleep but calmer, the fist shapes leaving her hands. Victoria was standing in the doorway. Ethan didn't notice her at first. He sat on the floor in the dark and kept talking in a low, even voice. And when he finally glanced toward the door, she was there, standing with one hand on the doorframe, her face unreadable. She watched him for a moment, then turned and went back to her room without a word. He stayed until Lily's breathing went slow and regular with sleep. Then he went back to his own room and lay down in the dark and thought, "Is this what you meant, Daniel? Is this the waiting you meant?" He thought it probably was. November arrived, and with it the domestic rhythm that Ethan had always found steadying. The smell of wood smoke, the particular quality of afternoon light through bare trees, the satisfaction of tasks completed against cold weather. He discovered, in his first 2 weeks in the Ridgeline Drive house, that the boiler ran inefficiently, that 3 of the west-facing windows had failing seals that let cold air seep in at the corners, and that the hot water heater was operating at 60% capacity because no one had serviced it in 2 years. He fixed all of it without being asked, ordering parts online and working on them in the mornings before the garage, leaving everything in better order than he'd found it. Victoria noticed. She didn't say anything directly, but one morning he came downstairs to find a receipt on the kitchen island. She had pre-authorized him to order whatever parts he needed, up to $3,000, no questions required. It was her way of saying thank you without having to perform gratitude. He understood this about her. He put the receipt in a drawer and ordered a replacement gasket for the laundry room drain. He started making breakfast. Not as a statement, it was just that he made breakfast for Noah every morning anyway, and it seemed inefficient to make it for one person when there were 4 people in the house. He made eggs and toast, or oatmeal, or the occasional stack of pancakes that were usually slightly burned on one side because he'd never quite mastered medium heat. He set 4 places at the table and left food in the pan, and didn't require anyone to sit down or engage. Victoria began appearing in the kitchen on a Tuesday in mid-November, while the pancakes were still in the pan. She stood in the doorway for a moment. He was beginning to understand that doorways were how she approached things she wasn't sure about, and then she came in and poured herself coffee and sat at the table. She didn't say, "Good morning." He didn't say, "Good morning." Noah said good morning to everyone 3 times, because Noah experienced mornings as an occasion, and Lily, who had recently started sitting at the table for breakfast rather than taking food to her room, watched Noah with something that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. These were the mornings of that house. Slightly burned pancakes, black coffee, Noah's chatter, Lily's careful silence, Victoria's composure that was slowly, incrementally, becoming something softer. Ethan found himself thinking, in the late evenings when the house was quiet, that this was the most settled he'd felt in years. Not happy, not unhappy, but grounded. which was its own kind of thing. He taught Noah and Lily to build a birdhouse one Saturday afternoon. He'd brought the wood and the tools from the garage, set up a workbench in the heated workshop at the back of the property. Noah was enthusiastic and imprecise, producing something structurally questionable but deeply personalized with red paint. Lily watched for 45 minutes before she picked up a small hammer and began working on the base of hers with a concentration so complete it was almost meditative. She built a solid, careful birdhouse. Every joint was tight. When she held it up to examine it, she looked over at Ethan just a glance, quick as a bird, a flicker of something that wanted acknowledgement, and he nodded. "Good work," he said. That was all. She put the birdhouse down and looked at it for a long moment, and then, very quietly, she smiled. It was the first time he'd seen her smile. He thought about calling Daniel's phone after that, which was something he'd done exactly once, 2 weeks after the funeral, before realizing what he was doing. He didn't call. He just stood in the workshop for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets and let the feeling settle. She's going to be okay, he thought. Daniel, she's going to be okay. In the third week of November, Hale Logistics had a crisis. A cold snap had moved through the high passes between Aspen and Glenwood Canyon, dropping temperatures to the kind that made diesel engines seize without warning. 7 of Victoria's long-haul trucks were stranded between 2 and 4 miles short of the depot. Engines shut down, cargoes cooling, drivers stuck and angry, one scheduled delivery to a hospital supply chain already 12 hours past due. Victoria took the call at 6 in the morning. Ethan heard her voice change in the kitchen, not louder, but denser, the way a stream sounds when it hits rocks. He came in to find her standing at the island with her phone, a laptop open, 3 other phones charging, and the particular quality of stillness she wore when she was managing something she didn't yet have a solution for. He asked 2 questions. He didn't editorialize or offer unsolicited advice. He asked, "What temperature are the engines reading when they try to turn over? And are the drivers running the heaters between attempts?" She told him. He pulled on his jacket and went to the garage on Galena Street, where he kept his truck and his tools, and he spent the next 4 hours coordinating with the stranded drivers by phone, walking them through a combination of block heater bypass, transmission fluid, rewarming, and for 2 of the trucks whose fuel lines had partially gelled, a technique involving warm water and patience that wasn't in any manual, but that Ethan had learned from a Canadian driver 17 years ago. By noon, 5 of the 7 trucks were running. By 3 in the afternoon, all 7 had made the depot. The hospital delivery, delayed by 14 hours, was rerouted and partially salvaged through an emergency arrangement with a secondary carrier that Ethan had used before and still had the contact number for. He came back to the house at 4:30, cold and tired, and found Victoria at the kitchen table with her laptop still open and the untouched remnants of what looked like 3 cups of tea. She looked at him when he came in. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. "Thank you," she said. Not the way she said most things, not crisp or efficient, just quietly, as if the word had weight in it. "It's a fuel gelling problem," he said. "Happens every winter in the high passes. I can walk your maintenance crew through a pre-season treatment protocol if you want. Would save you this next time." She looked at him for a moment. And then, because neither of them was quite sure what to do with the fact that something had just shifted, they both looked at their respective cups of coffee or tea and said nothing, and the silence was not the same kind of silence it had been before. It was, Ethan thought, a slightly warmer silence. The board of Hale Logistics, meanwhile, was conducting their own assessment. The crisis had been contained quickly and professionally, more quickly, 2 members noted privately, than previous crises had been under the same leadership. There were those on the board who had been watching Victoria since Daniel's death, measuring the distance between her capability and her state of mind. The assumption had always been that she would eventually falter. She had not faltered. But she had asked for help, which was, for Victoria Hale, a form of evolution. Marcus Hale, who attended the November board meeting, noted that his sister-in-law looked, for the first time in 14 months, like a woman who had slept a full night recently. He said nothing about this. He filed it away. He was, like all Hales, a man who paid attention. The second time Victoria offered Ethan the money was on a Friday evening in December, when the house smelled of the chili he'd made for dinner, and Noah and Lily were both asleep, and the mountain outside the windows was lit by a full moon on fresh snow. She had found the bank statement. Not snooping, she'd been looking for the garage insurance renewal in his office, which she'd needed to forward to their joint accountant, and the bank statement had been sitting open on the desk. She hadn't meant to read it. But she'd seen a recurring transfer, $1,400 a month, consistently, to a payee listed as Aspen Integrated Counseling Services, Dr. Pratt's office. She'd called Dr. Pratt's billing department on Monday morning, carefully, and learned that Lily's therapy, 3 sessions a week for the past 5 months, had been billed to an account under Ethan Cole's name, not the family account, not the household account, his personal account. She'd also discovered, by way of a conversation with her household manager, that Ethan had never drawn his agreed monthly expense allowance from the household account not once in 7 months. Every personal expense he'd incurred in this house, he'd covered himself. She had done the math. It wasn't a small number. She brought the check to his office on Friday evening. Same envelope, same number. She placed it on his desk. He looked at it, then at her. "You've been paying for Lily's therapy," she said. He didn't confirm or deny it. He looked at the envelope. "For 5 months," she said. "And you never put in for the expense account. Not once. I didn't need the money." "That's not." She stopped, started again. "That's not the point, Ethan. The point is that you've been doing this and not telling me." As if she paused, searching. "As if you were trying to make yourself indispensable without my knowing. As if were. Victoria. Constructing some kind of obligation. Victoria." His voice was quiet, even. "I wasn't trying to make you feel anything. I paid for the therapy because Lily needed it, and it was easier to set up the billing that way, and I didn't think about it again. That's the entire story." She looked at him. "Take the check," she said. Her voice was tighter than she intended. "Ethan, I'm not going to take money for taking care of Daniel's kid. I know you're trying to turn it into a transaction so you don't have to feel like you owe me anything. But you don't owe me anything. I'm here because I want to be here. You made a promise to a dead man," she said, "and it came out harder than she meant it to. That's not the same as wanting to be somewhere." "Maybe it started that way," he said. "I don't know anymore." She picked up the envelope. For a moment she just held it, looking at him, and he looked back, and neither of them moved. "I don't know what to do with you," she said finally. It was the most honest thing she'd said to him in 7 months. "You don't have to do anything with me," he said. "Just leave the check." She left the check. She also left the room and went to her bedroom, and stood in the dark for a long time, and did not cry, could not, quite, though something in her chest was very close to it. She thought about the way Lily had handed Ethan a piece of toast this morning, just reached across the table and placed it on his plate without being asked, because she'd noticed his plate was empty, as if it were the most natural thing, as if he had always been there. She thought about how long it had been since anything in this house had felt natural. She found the USB drive in January. She had been going through a box of Daniel's things, a task she'd put off for 14 months. One of those tasks that exists in the permanent future where you never quite arrive. The box was in the closet of what used to be his home office, and she'd been putting it off because every time she opened the closet door, she could still, sometimes, catch the faint memory of his presence, the particular kind of nothing that is the ghost of a smell. The USB was in a padded envelope with her name on it, tucked under a stack of folders. Daniel's handwriting on the envelope. She sat down on the floor of the closet with it in her hands for a full minute before she opened it. It was a video file. 6 minutes and 40 seconds, recorded on the camera of his laptop. The date in the corner of the file was 4 days before he died. He looked thin. He looked tired. But he was sitting up straight, in the way that was quintessentially Daniel. He had always held himself like a man who believed in his own structural integrity, even at the end, and he was looking directly at the camera. And when he began to speak, his voice was careful and deliberate, a voice used to saying important things to important people. He talked about Lily. He said that Lily was not a child who would be helped by noise or rushing, that she needed stillness and patience, and someone who understood that grief moves at its own pace and cannot be scheduled. He said that she had her mother's stubbornness. He smiled when he said this, a small, private smile, and her mother's depth, and that when she finally opened up to someone, it would be someone she had decided to trust completely. And that trust, for Lily, was not given but earned over time. He talked about Victoria. "She's going to tell you she's fine," he said, to whoever was supposed to watch this. "She's going to manage things and handle things and insist she doesn't need anything from anyone. And some of that is true. She is extraordinary, and she will manage, and she will be fine eventually. But the key word is eventually. What she can't do alone is let herself be known. She doesn't let people in. She never has. Not even me, all the way. And I was the person she loved most." He paused, looked at something off camera, then back. "She's not cold," he said. "I need whoever is watching this to understand that. She's afraid. There's a difference, and it matters. And if you confuse one for the other, you will give up too soon." He said a few other things about the company, about some financial arrangements, about a letter to Lily he'd left with a lawyer to be opened on her 16th birthday. Then he looked at the camera again and said, quietly, "I know you'll look after them, Eth. I knew it before I asked. I just needed to say it out loud. I knew it before I asked." Victoria sat on the floor of the closet for a very long time. She did not know how long she sat there. She was aware, at some point, of the sounds of the house, Noah's voice somewhere downstairs, the low talk of cartoons, the sound of a pot being set on the stove, footsteps that she had, by now, learned to identify as Ethan's without thinking about it. She sat with the laptop open in her lap. The video paused at the last frame, Daniel's face still and patient on the screen. She started crying. Not the polished kind, not the contained kind, not the kind she had performed at the funeral for the sake of appearances. The real kind, the kind that doesn't have a beginning or an end. The kind that is less like sadness and more like a door opening in your chest that has been sealed shut for too long and needs, finally, to open. She cried for Daniel, who had known her better than she knew herself, and who had arranged, in the last careful acts of his life, for her to be looked after. She cried for Lily, who had spent a year in the remote country of her grief and was slowly, carefully, finding her way back. She cried for herself, for the version of herself who had stood at a hospital bedside, holding herself together so thoroughly that she had forgotten to fall apart until now, 14 months later, on the floor of a closet. She cried until she was empty. When she came downstairs, 40 minutes later, Ethan was at the stove. He looked at her face once, just once, a quick, assessing look, and he turned back to the stove without comment. He handed her a mug of tea. He did not ask if she was all right. She sat at the kitchen island, both hands around the mug. "He left you a video," she said finally. Ethan went still at the stove. "What?" "A USB, in his office. He recorded it 4 days before he died." She looked at her tea. "He said you'd look after us. He said he knew it before he asked." Ethan set down the spoon he was holding. He gripped the edge of the counter for a moment. His back was to her. "Yeah," he said. And then nothing else, because there was nothing else to say. The soup on the stove simmered. The house held them both in its quiet. Outside, the January mountains were very white, very still, very far. February was the month things became real. Not romantic, not yet, or not exactly. But real in the way that a table is real, or a window, or the sound of someone moving through a house you've lived in long enough to know by sound alone. Victoria learned that Ethan made his coffee too strong and took 3 sugars, which seemed incongruous until she understood it was because he'd given up sugar in everything else. She learned that he read at night, not screens, actual books, always 2 or 3 going at once, left face down on various surfaces, which drove her mildly insane until she started leaving bookmarks near his reading spots. She learned that he was patient with everyone except himself, that he held his own mistakes to a standard he would never apply to another person. He learned that she worked best when she was angry, that frustration sharpened her rather than clouding her, and that the best thing to do when she was stuck on a problem was not to offer solutions, but to sit nearby and disagree with her previous conclusions until she argued herself into a better one. He learned that she cried at movies about animals, but not at movies about people. He learned that she had a loud and entirely unexpected laugh, full and sudden, like something breaking that came out approximately 3 times a year when something surprised her into it. He made her laugh in February. She was trying to fold a large piece of parchment paper in the kitchen, some recipe project she'd decided to attempt on a Saturday. Both children in the next room. The parchment resistant and ridiculous. It had accordioned itself into a shape that defied geometry, and she was holding it at arm's length with both hands, staring at it with an expression of pure, affronted disbelief. And Ethan had said, perfectly evenly, "I think it won." The laugh came out of her like something that had been stored under pressure. She covered her mouth immediately, reflex, but it was already there. Already real. Already in the room. Noah, from the next room, said, "Mom laughed." He had been calling her Mom for 3 weeks by that point. It had started without announcement. He'd just done it one morning, the way children do things, as a statement of self-evident fact, and Victoria had stopped moving for a full 3 seconds and then continued what she was doing and said nothing about it. But that evening, Ethan had found her standing at the kitchen window for a long time after dinner, very still, and when he asked if she wanted more coffee, she shook her head and said, quietly, "He called me Mom today." "I know," Ethan said. "Does that?" She turned. "Does that bother you? Should I have said something to him about?" "No," Ethan said. "Noah chooses things with his whole heart. When he decides someone matters to him, that's just who they are." He paused. "He's been like that since he was 3. She looked at him for a moment. "He's a good kid," she said. "Yeah," Ethan said. "He is." The moment with Lily happened on a Sunday in late February during a snowshoe walk that had started as a family obligation, the kind of thing that appears on the shared calendar and everyone shows up to without enthusiasm, and had turned, somewhere between the tree line and the creek crossing, into something else entirely. Lily had gotten ahead on the trail, as she sometimes did when she was feeling more herself. She was picking her way across a narrow wooden bridge, very focused, snowshoes slightly wide for her small feet. Ethan was behind her, close enough to catch her if the bridge was slippier than it looked. She made it across, turned back to check, and her snowshoe caught the bridge post, and she tipped sideways into a 3-foot snowbank at the edge of the trail. She came up sputtering, covered in snow from shoulder to forehead, snow in her collar, snow in her hair, looking for one incredulous second like an offended owl. Ethan reached in and pulled her up by the arm, and she was shaking with something that wasn't distress. He could tell the difference by now, and then the shaking resolved into laughter. Real laughter, unguarded, the kind that a child laughs when something is simply and purely funny. He laughed too. They stood there in the snow, both laughing, and from behind them he heard Victoria make a small sound, not quite a laugh, but close, and then Lily looked up at him, snow still in her hair, and said, in a voice he'd heard very rarely and always treated like something fragile and worth protecting, "Dad would have fallen in too." A moment passed. The trees stood. The snow fell softly. "He absolutely would have," Ethan said. He had no respect for bridges. Lily smiled. Then she reached over and knocked more snow off her jacket, businesslike, and said, "Come on," and walked on down the trail. He followed her. That evening, after dinner, after Noah was in bed and Lily had gone upstairs to read, Victoria sat across from him at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around her habitual evening tea, and she said, "She called you Dad today." "Yeah." "Not?" Victoria stopped. "Not instead of Daniel." "I want to be clear that I don't think that's what she meant." "I know that's not what she meant," Ethan said, "but I think she meant something. I think she meant something too," he said. They sat with that for a while. The house settled around them, the small creaks and adjustments of a structure in cold weather, familiar and particular, and already without his quite deciding when home. March arrived in Aspen, as it always does, reluctantly, with false starts, with days of warmth that get undone overnight, and mornings that still look like January even when the calendar says otherwise. Ethan was on the porch when Victoria came out. Not the morning with the check that had been 2 weeks ago now, an eternity in the compressed time of this house. This was a different morning, earlier, quieter. The town below was still dark. The mountains were beginning to take on the pre-dawn gray that Ethan had, without particularly meaning to, started thinking of as the best hour of the day. She came out without the blazer this time. She was in the kind of clothes you wear when you are not expecting to be observed: soft pants, an oversized sweater that he recognized as one of Daniel's, pale and worn at the elbows. She had her own coffee. She stood beside him at the railing and looked at the mountains. They stood like that for a while. "I owe you an apology," she said finally. "You don't. I kept trying to pay you off," she said, "because paying you off would have made this a transaction, and transactions are things I understand." He could hear her choosing words carefully, the way she always chose words carefully, but without the armor in it this time. "It was also because I was afraid of what it would mean if you weren't here for the money, because then I'd have to figure out what you were actually here for, and I wasn't ready to do that." He said nothing. The mountains were turning pink at the edges. "Daniel said, 'I don't let people in,'" she said. "In the video. He said, 'I don't let people all the way in, not even him.'" She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "He wasn't wrong." "I know," Ethan said. "He told me too." "Not the video, just over the years. And you came anyway." "I came anyway." She looked at him sideways. Why? He thought about it. Thought about the right words for something that was not small, that had been growing in him over 7 months like a slow and patient thing, like a tree that doesn't announce itself but is eventually simply there. "Because you were someone Daniel loved," he said slowly, "and that meant I already knew something important about you. Even before I knew you." He paused. "And then the more I knew you, the more I understood he was right to love you. And then—" He stopped. "And then?" she said. "And then it stopped being about Daniel," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The mountains were lighter now, the gray deepening into rose. Below them, the town was beginning to show its first small lights. "I don't know how to do this," she said. Not helplessly, Victoria said nothing helplessly. But honestly, "I don't know how to be with someone without protecting myself from them." "I know," he said. "That doesn't worry you?" She looked at him. "Why not?" He turned to look at her then, and she was watching him in that careful way she had, the way that was not cold, had never been cold, was exactly what Daniel said it was, fear that had learned to look like composure. "Because you're already doing it," he said. "You're standing on the porch in Daniel's sweater at 5 in the morning telling me the truth. That's," he shook his head slightly, "that's not someone who doesn't know how." She looked down at her coffee. A long pause. "I was so lonely," she said quietly. "After Daniel died. Even before, sometimes even when he was there. I was so lonely, and I never let him see it." "He saw it," Ethan said. She looked up. "He didn't need you to show him," Ethan said. "He just knew." She stood still for a moment, then she turned back to the mountains, and he turned back to the mountains, and they stood there together, while the light changed from gray to pink to the clear crystalline gold of a mountain morning, and neither of them said anything for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was very quiet, and it was the voice she used when she wasn't protecting anything. "I don't want this to be a contract anymore. It hasn't been a contract in a long time," he said. She reached over and put her hand on his arm. Not a dramatic gesture, just a hand on his arm, warm and certain and simple. He covered it with his own. They stood like that while the sun came up. Inside the house, there were small sounds. The creak of a hallway floorboard under careful feet. The sound of the refrigerator opening. The low voice of the television, Noah's Arctic birds again. And then Noah's voice itself, calling toward the back of the house. "Dad! Mom! The coffee's cold!" Lily's voice, more measured, from the stairs. "There's more in the pot." Noah, undeterred. "But yours is cold. Both of you." They heard him through the glass, loud and warm and entirely himself. And Victoria's hand pressed slightly on his arm. And she made that sound again, the real laugh, the sudden one, full and unconstrained, rising into the cold morning air. Ethan laughed too. "From inside," Noah said, "I can hear you laughing. Why are you laughing?" They came in from the cold. The kitchen was warm. The coffee, as Noah had correctly identified, needed reheating. Lily was sitting at the island with a book, feet tucked beneath her. The crescent moon nightlight charging on the counter beside her even though it was morning, because she'd taken to carrying it around the house the way some children carry certain objects, not for function, but for company. Victoria sat across from Lily and poured herself a fresh cup. Ethan reheated the coffee. Noah told everyone, at length and with great detail, about the migration patterns of the Arctic tern. Outside, the March snow was falling lightly on the mountains of Aspen, soft and without urgency. The kind of snow that doesn't mean to cover anything. Just falling because that's what it does. Just filling the world with small, white, quiet, one flake at a time. The house held 4 people who had come together through loss and circumstance, and the particular stubbornness of a promise made in a storm. The house held a family. It had not been chosen all at once, or easily, or without cost. It had been chosen in small moments, in burned pancakes and borrowed bookmarks and a river stone on a window ledge, in a man sitting on the floor in the dark, talking to a frightened child until she could sleep, in a woman standing in a doorway, watching something she didn't yet have words for, in a daughter who built a birdhouse with careful joints and looked up for acknowledgement and received it without ceremony, as if it were the most natural thing, which it was, which it had become. The snow fell. The coffee was warm. In the kitchen on Ridgeline Drive, in the particular light of a March morning in Aspen, something that had started as a promise and become a choice, and then became something without a name, something larger and quieter than either. Continued. Simply, to be. Ethan Cole had not come to save anyone. He had just not left. It turned out that was exactly enough.